The good of the order will now be conducted by the worthy lecturer. I trust to the enjoyment, instruction, and edification of all present. Now you're on. Thanks.
Thank you, worthy Grand Knight. Try to move this along. I'm going to be just a little bit cheeky with you this evening and not explain just exactly what it is I'm talking about or where I'm going until the end. So I ask you to bear with me a bit. I want to begin with Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich. Most of you probably have at least a passing familiarity with her. She was a German nun born in Flemish, Westphalia in 1774. She was one of 9 children, grew up on a farm, very poor, wanted to enter into religious life from an early age. She was unable to do so because at the time you either had to pay a dowry, some kind of contribution to the order, or you had to have some sort of skill, like an ability to play the organ that the order needed or wanted. And she couldn't meet either of those criteria. So she wasn't able to enter into religious life until 1802 when she became an Augustinian nun. And for the next few years, the Augustinians basically just lent her out to area farms. So, when the harvest came in, if the family needed extra labor or someone was ill, she milked the cows, mucked out the stables, threshed the grain, did the kind of real work that would kill me after about 6 minutes. But that's what she did for several years. Then in 1813, she developed a stigmata. She began to bleed with wounds that mirrored the wounds that Jesus had received during his crucifixion. If you've read anything about the stigmata, it's almost always accompanied by visions, and it is extremely taxing physically and psychologically. Most stigmatics are just bedridden, which was the case with Anne Catherine Emmerich. She became something of a minor celebrity. She had a number of visitors. One of them was an Italian poet, Clemens Bertano, who became a friend, who came back several times, and who began to take notes of her visions. She died in 1824. 1833, after her death, Bertano began to organize his notes. And he realized that her visions really fall into 2 buckets. There are those that deal with the Passion of our Lord, which he collected into one book called The Dolorous Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was published in 1838. And just as a point of interest, Mel Gibson relied very heavily on her visions as described in that book for his movie The Passion of Christ. The second set of visions dealt with the life of the Blessed Mother. And he did compile a second volume of her visions, all dealing with the life of Mary, actually titled the book The Life of the Blessed Virgin Mary. But he died before it could be published, and so he just kind of sat around for a bit. It wasn't actually published until 1852. Now, it is church tradition that the Apostle John was responsible for the care and custody of Mary after the resurrection, or after the crucifixion. We would read that passage in John's Gospel where Jesus is on the cross and he says, behold your mother, and woman, behold your son. And one of the meanings of that in Catholic thought is that John became the disciple or the person responsible for caring for Mary after the resurrection and then the ascension. We have good early testimony, including Irenaeus writing in the 2nd century, that John went to Ephesus. There's some information in the Bible that sort of hints at that. We don't have time it's an interesting footnote we don't have time to get into this evening. But it is the Catholic understanding that the 2 of them went to live in Ephesus. And it turns out that a lot of Anne Catherine's visions related to the life of Mary have to do with her time in Ephesus, including descriptions of the house where she lived, the setting. And according to Anne Catherine, Mary did not live in the city of Ephesus. She lived about 8 to 10 miles south of the city, up in the hills. And she gives this description of the house and the hills and what she could see from basically her front yard. And in 1881, a French priest named Father Julien Goyer got the crazy idea to take Anne Catherine's visions and go to Ephesus and try to see if he could figure out, where this spot was. And he found the ruins of a small stone building located basically at a spot that really corresponded well with Anne Catherine's visions. And he became convinced that this was the ruins of the house where Mary had lived during her time in Ephesus. Well, his idea was not very well accepted, except by one person, a French nun, Sister Marie de Mandat-Grancey, who coincidentally, was assigned to a missionary hospital in in Anatolia, what's now Turkey, in 1886. And while she was there, she prevailed upon two Lazarist priests, Father Eugene Poland and Father Henri Young, to go try to retrace Goyet's journey and see if they could find this ruined building that Goyet had tentatively identified as the house where Mary lived. They actually took up this task to disprove the idea, because they're sort of tired of this nun badgering them about it. But they put together an expeditionary team. They went to Ephesus. They followed the descriptions given in the visions. They talked to some of the locals who had met with Father Goyet when he was there a few years earlier, and they were able to find this ruined stone building that does indeed seem to correspond quite well to the descriptions given in Aunt Catherine's visions. And it's important to remember, this is a woman with basically no education, had never been to Ephesus. No archaeological investigation of Ephesus had been done at that time. Brutano hadn't been to Ephesus. And yet we have this very intriguing description. Now, this area came under Muslim control in the early 8th century. So Fathers Poulin and Fathers Young, they find this ruined stone building, but they find something else. This is the thing that's really interesting, at least to me. They find that, notwithstanding the fact that this area came under Muslim control in the 8th century, about 10 miles from the location of the ruin, there is a tiny village, and it's a Christian village. And the people who live there are direct descendants of the Christian church at Ephesus, founded by Paul, overseen by John. And they are very familiar with this ruin. They refer to it as the Virgin's Door. In fact, they have an annual procession to this ruin. And when do they have this procession? On August 15th, the date that the church has recognized since time immemorial as the Feast of the Assumption, the date we remember Mary's Assumption into heaven, which is where I was going with this from the beginning. Because, of course, we're coming up upon the Feast of the Assumption, Holy Day of Obligation. We tend to think of heaven as our destination, but of course it's really a temporary destination. Ultimately, we believe in resurrection. Ultimately, we believe that we will receive glorified bodies. When Jesus is resurrected, he has his glorified body. So it has some connection to the physical body, right? The tomb was empty, but he's able to pass through walls. He's able to change his appearance. It's a different, kind of a higher frequency of reality than the way we experience our bodies today. It's a perfect body. It doesn't know disease. It doesn't age, that sort of thing. That is our ultimate destination. And I find this story intriguing at lots of levels. Of course, these are private revelations. They're not certainly not inerrant, necessarily pronounced upon by the church. You could be a perfectly good Catholic and choose not to believe them. But there's just, for me personally, too many things line up. Because the archaeological work that was done a few years later, the church bought the property, by the way. The archaeological work that was done a few years later confirmed that this stone ruin was a chapel that had been built over a first century house. The chapel has since been reconstructed. It's a pilgrimage site. The house you can go into, it's a 2-room house, just as was described in the visions of Aunt Catherine. So I just find this remarkable that this ancient tradition was preserved in an area where everybody had been Muslim for 1,100 years by this tiny remnant population of Christians from the original Christian church at Ephesus. And it's a good reminder, a good story to tell at this time of the year as we reflect on the meaning of the Assumption, right? That Mary didn't have to undergo a normal death, that she was free from sin, so she was able to go directly to heaven and receive her glorified body, which of course is ultimately our own, our hoped-for destiny. So that's what I wanted to tell you this evening, and remind you that we have an upcoming Holy Day of Obligation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris.